All you need is a jar, a cutting board, a knife, some vegetables, and some salt. They're incredibly delicious. They complement, almost any kind of savory food. They're full of probiotics. It's a way to make sure you get lots of plant-based vitamins, even with the, food you're eating on the run. So, I just think fermenting vegetables has everything to recommend it, and is just a perfect first project.
If someone wanted to use this downtime to lose their fermenting virginity, what would be the kind of entry level? What would be a good place to start?
Well, I would say that my gateway into fermentation was sauerkraut. And I love to recommend sauerkraut as a first fermentation project to people because, number one, it's incredibly easy. Like, all you do is you chop vegetables, lightly salt them, pound them or squeeze them for a few minutes to help break down cell walls and make them juicy, and then, pack them into a jar and wait. It's incredibly, incredibly easy. The other thing that I think is great about it is, to whatever extent people might project their anxiety about bacteria onto the process of fermentation, fermenting vegetables is about the safest food that exists. After you ferment vegetables, they become much, much safer, statistically speaking, than they were raw. If your fermented vegetables end up making somebody sick, it'll be an unprecedented historical event. That's another reason why I like to recommend fermenting vegetables.
If someone did want to lose their fermentation virginity with you in your safe hands, could you show us what the gateway to making sauerkraut is? What's kind of sauerkraut 101?
Yeah, sure. So give me a moment. Let me go. Let me go find a cutting board and a knife and a cabbage and some salt and a jar. So I'm just going to peel off those outer leaves until we have something that looks reasonably clean. Okay, so we got there. And then I'm going to just take the bottom off. And I quarter it, and then I cut the core off. I'm not gonna throw the core away, but I'm just gonna slice it separately. And then once the core is off, then as you slice the cabbage, it just falls apart, and the core doesn't bind it together. So just to help people gauge how much vegetables they need, a liter-sized jar will take about 1 kilogram of vegetables. I'm not very good at maintaining a narrative while I'm chopping vegetables. Typically, when I do demonstrations, I pre-chop the vegetables because people don't really get that much out of watching me chop.
Yeah. I don't know, some people might pay good money for this. Some chopping fetishist. Yeah.
Classically, sauerkraut is just cabbage, but you can really add virtually any vegetable to sauerkraut. Feel free to experiment. There's definitely no danger in experimenting, but don't experiment in 200-liter vessels. Experiment in small jars so you can figure out what you like and what you don't like. For instance, kale. You could treat kale exactly as you treat cabbage, but it has a much stronger flavor because that dark green has all this chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll has a much stronger flavor. And some people love that stronger flavor, and some people are really put off by that stronger flavor. You can ferment zucchini in the same method, but it's not going to stay crisp for as long as cabbage will. It'll have a tendency to get soft and mushy, not dangerous, but, maybe aesthetically not as pleasing to many people. So, feel free to experiment, but understand that, different vegetables will have different characteristics. I love to add some carrot to my sauerkraut, just to add color, just to add flavor and variety. So I'm going to go ahead and grate a couple of carrots in with the cabbage here. And by the way, you can use a food processor. You can use, various automated tools. When I'm doing this on a small scale, I prefer to use hand tools. Is this an awkward view? My head seems like it's cut off.
You're sort of semi-decapitated.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do is add a little bit of salt to this. You could weigh this, and then you could, calculate a salt proportion. A number of people toss around a lot is 2% salt. Personally, I prefer a little bit less than 2% salt. But, what I've observed from, doing this process with a lot of people, and sometimes I'll have small groups of people shred vegetables together and then decide how much salt they want to add. Like I advocate salting to taste. Like there is no magical number that science has given us as like the amount of salt that this process requires. I mean, in fact, there are people who do it without any salt. I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think it tastes very good. It certainly doesn't maintain a very good texture. Going back just a few generations, I mean, this is survival food. This is what gets you vitamin C to get through the winter without developing scurvy. And so because salt is a preservative in its own right, in a lot of traditions, it's gotten passed down as a very salty food. If you're, sort of watching this in, the springtime in the UK, and you're making this not so much for survival through a long, harsh winter, but rather for something delicious that you're going to enjoy and your family is going to enjoy, something healthy, something probiotic, there's no necessity to add a large amount of salt. The first thing salt does is it starts to draw water out of the vegetables. And the environmental manipulation that we're trying to accomplish here is to get the vegetables submerged. If we just left this bowl of loosely shredded vegetables on the counter for 2 weeks, it's not going to turn itself into sauerkraut, and it's very predictable what would happen, which is that like a hairy mold would develop on all of the cut surfaces. And especially if the weather gets hot and humid, that hairy mold could just turn this whole bowl of shredded vegetables into a puddle of slime.
So really, you've put in a sprinkle of salt there.
I'm just putting a sprinkle of salt. I'm using large grain salt. It doesn't matter. Use whatever kind of salt that you have. I like to salt it lightly with the idea that I will add more salt. If you look in a cookbook, you're never going to find a recipe for lentil soup that's going to tell you how much salt to add. They're all going to say at the end of the recipe, salt to taste. This is not any different from that. Make it taste the way you like it to taste. So I like to lightly sprinkle it with salt as I shred the vegetables so that the salt can start to pull juice out of the vegetables by the process of osmosis. And then what I like to do is get in there with my hands and squeeze the vegetables. And what this does basically is it hastens the release of juice from the vegetables. So it's breaking down cell walls and helping to release juice as the salt is pulling juice out. Then once everything is nice and juicy, then I'll taste it and I'll decide if I want to add salt. But It's always easier to add salt than it is to subtract salt. You can also add all kinds of seasonings. I think what I'm going to do is add some caraway seeds. Sometimes people add juniper berries. In the Russian tradition, people sometimes add some dried fruit like cranberries or apples or raisins. People make curry krauts. I mean, it's really... the possibilities are infinite. I mean, the only limitation is our imaginations. So I'm going to just grab some caraway seeds.
What's the strangest thing that you've added to your sauerkraut?
Well, I met this woman a few years back whose family came from a town in Poland where everybody bulked up their sauerkraut with mashed potatoes. And I love to make mashed potato sauerkraut, mostly just because it's so unexpected for people.
Well, in terms of, if you were really to kind of go out there, what would be the wackiest thing you could ferment that's maybe in the back of your cupboard or fridge?
Well, you see, people ask me this question all the time, and I can't answer it. Like, there's nothing we could possibly eat that could not be fermented. So once you accept that idea, then what's a weird ferment? Fermented fish. I eat fermented fish all the time. I eat fish sauce. When I went to Japan, I was interested in the history of sushi. Like, would you eat at a sushi restaurant that didn't have a refrigerator? What do you think sushi was before the advent of refrigeration? It was a strategy of fermenting fish in a bed of rice. But anything you could possibly eat could be fermented.
So could you take some dark chocolate out of the cupboard and then ferment that further?
Then sure, you could take that chocolate and put it in some sort of like fermented sourdough pancake mix and make chocolate chip fermented pancakes. There's a whole genre of sauerkraut chocolate cakes. So there's all kinds of ways you could incorporate chocolate into a ferment.
Could you do a straightforward chocolate sauerkraut?
Sure. I don't think it would be that good, but you mean like put pieces of chocolate in this veggie mix? Sure. I want you to try it and let me know how it goes.
Okay, I'm going to try it.
Back to our main project here. That from squeezing this and the presence of the salt on the vegetables, it's getting juicy. And my test for this, and I'm going to push this a little closer to you, is I like to pick up a little handful and squeeze it. And when I see juice running down like that, that's telling me that when I pack the vegetables into a vessel, they're going to be able to be submerged under their own juices. And this is, really the, essential environmental manipulation, is that we get the vegetables submerged so there's not a steady flow of air, which would enable molds to grow. And so getting it submerged protects it from molds developing and instead encourages the development of lactic acid bacteria, which are on all vegetables, on all plants. And when you get them submerged, they're always the thing that dominates. That's what makes this such a reliable process. And now I'm just going to taste a piece because I remember I lightly salted it with the idea that I might have to add salt. And I think it needs a little bit more salt. So I'm going to just add, that's probably like a teaspoon more salt. You want to add salt a little bit at a time. You can always add salt later in the process if you discover that you've just horrendously oversalted it. What you can do to remove salt is cover it with water, let it sit for a few minutes covered with water, and pour water off. The problem is that you're never removing only salt. You're also removing nutrients and flavor. So, I'd really recommend adding salt very slowly. You could add other things into this. You could add onion. You could add garlic. You could add parsnip, turnip, red cabbage. Pretty much anything. Okay, I'm happy with the salt level there. And then what I'm going to use as a vessel is just a simple jar. This is like American style. We call these like mason jars or ball jars. You can work with Kilner jars that are available in the UK, or any kind of jar really. You could use a mayonnaise jar that was that's left over from the supermarket, and then you just pack it into the vessel. And then you really want to pack it down with some force and eliminate any kind of air pockets as you go. And then you'll see that when we finally pack this down, we're going to have the liquid rising to submerge the vegetables. So is that it? Yeah, that's. So you see how as I pack it down, the vegetables are getting submerged. And then you never want to fill your jar to the very, very top. You always want to leave a little bit, a centimeter or two of space at least at the top, because as this comes alive and starts to generate carbon dioxide, it's going to lift everything up. And so if you fill it to the very top, then it'll just end up spilling out. And if you leave a little bit of space, then it's more likely to remain contained. Now, the one final thing is no matter how juicy these vegetables are, when you stop putting weight on it, they will absorb the excess liquid. So what I like to do, I have some small, little disc weights that I sometimes use. Those work fine, but just because I'm assuming that a lot of the people who watch this, won't have gadgets like that around. What I often like to do is save outer leaves of the cabbage that have a big spine on them, and use those outer leaves to hold everything down. And then if anything ends up floating to the top, it's the outer leaf of the cabbage, and that ends up sort of functioning as a sacrificial piece of vegetable. Now all we have to do is wait. The big question in fermentation is how long do you wait and how do you know when it's ready? And there's no straightforward answer to that, unfortunately.
Ballpark?
The longer you wait, the stronger the flavor will become. So, I have, all of this radish kraut that I made in November. It's been sitting in my cellar for 5 months. It's really delicious. It's extremely acidic. Only people who really like kraut like it. The people who like it love it. But if you're someone who's like, oh, the flavor of sauerkraut's a little bit too strong for me, I wouldn't recommend the long fermented kraut to you. The acids accumulate over time. If you prefer milder flavors, you're probably going to like it more after a week than you're going to like it after 5 months. What I recommend for most people who are doing this for the first time at home is give it 3 or 4 days, taste a little bit of it, pack it back down, give it 3 or 4 more days, taste it again. You'll notice that the taste is stronger after a week than it was at 3 days. And if you keep on tasting it at intervals of 3 or 4 days, you'll get to really, experience the spectrum of flavors that are possible. And then if one day you taste it and you think like, wow, this is getting strong, I'm not sure I want the flavor to get any stronger than this. Well, I'll bet pretty much everybody watching this has a fermentation slowing device in their kitchen. That's what a refrigerator amounts to. And that's when you move it to the refrigerator. But it's not necessary to move it into a refrigerator, but at cooler temperatures, it will stabilize and not continue to ferment so quickly.
So it's as simple as that, really. It's you make that and you just put it in the corner of the kitchen or somewhere.
Yeah. I like to leave it. I like to not hide it. Some people insist on total darkness and hide it in a cabinet or in a pantry. I think it's important for people to remember that it's there. And the other thing is if you put a lid on it, it will require some manual off-gassing, because this will produce a lot of carbon dioxide, especially in the early days. The carbon dioxide will slow down as the fermentation continues.
And will it be a bit pongy in the kitchen whilst it's developing?
A bit pongy.
A little bit smelly?
Oh, well, sure. Cabbage has sulfur compounds that are breaking down, and definitely sauerkraut has a distinctive odor. I love the smell of it, but I know from my emails that not everybody loves the smell of it. Especially as we're getting into warmer weather, if you're not crazy about the smell of it, put it near a window. Just to be a voice for the smell is beautiful. Don't assume that you won't like the smell. But, personally, I find, almost all the smells of it to be quite lovely.
Do you think one of the benefits you've experienced is a fabulous beard growth?
Well, before I even had a beard, my hair has always grown fast. My fingernails have always grown fast. So I actually think that that's more of a constitutional thing, but who knows?
Yeah, sauerkraut for hair loss would be would be quite something.
Well, when I was in the UK last year, I met this woman who told me that she had a great aunt who would clean carpets with sauerkraut. So people use sauerkraut for all kinds of things, crazier than hair growth.
Yeah. I've not come across that yet, but I'll give it a try. Maybe after the chocolate. Sandor, thank you so much. Yeah, inspiring. I feel the need to go out and buy a mason jar now. I've done my own kombucha. I think now I'm ready to go to sauerkraut.
Great. Okay, well, if you need anything else from me, let me know.
Perfect.
And thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much.